I spent 3 years trying to prove I wasn't insane. And then the 12 cameras showed me something that made me realize proving myself didn't matter anymore. What they captured wasn't a legendary creature in its prime. It was something far more heartbreaking, a life in its final chapters, and a message I was meant to understand. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 49 years old, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't about finding proof. They're about learning what to do when you finally have it. Before the cameras, before the cabin, before any of this, I was someone else entirely. I was a documentary filmmaker, not a famous one, but respected in the circles that mattered. I'd spent 15 years building a reputation for capturing wildlife in moments of raw authenticity. I had won awards. I had worked for National Geographic. I had a house in Portland, a marriage that looked good in photos, and a career trajectory that was supposed to keep climbing upward. I had everything that was supposed to matter. And then in 2015, I saw something in the woods that destroyed all of it. It was autumn, October 23rd to be exact. I was filming a short documentary about cougar behavior in the Cascade Range, about 40 miles from the nearest town. I'd hiked into a remote valley to set up time-lapse cameras, the kind of work I'd done hundreds of times before. The light was failing. You get maybe 20 minutes of good golden hour light before it's gone completely. And I was racing against the sunset to finish my setup. I was alone. No crew, no backup, no one to verify what happened next. I heard it first. Not the sound people describe in the Bigfoot community, not a howl or a shriek. It was something quieter, more unsettling. A deep, resonant vocalization that seemed to come from the forest itself. The kind of sound that makes your nervous system respond before your conscious mind catches up. I turned toward it, camera still in hand, and that's when I saw the figure. It was there for maybe 3 seconds, standing at the edge of a clearing partially obscured by the failing light and the trees. I could make out massive shoulders, dark fur, a face that was both human and profoundly not human. It was watching me, not aggressively, not with hunger, with something that looked almost like curiosity. My instinct was to film it. I raised my camera, but my hands were shaking so badly that the image was useless. By the time I steadied myself, it was gone. Simply turned and walked back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. My heart was hammering. My breathing was shallow. Every part of my training as a scientist told me what I'd seen was impossible. Bigfoot didn't exist. The body of evidence was circumstantial at best, hoaxed at worst. Any wildlife biologist worth their credentials would tell you that. But I'd seen it. I knew what I'd seen. I hiked out of the forest in darkness, my headlamp creating a small circle of visibility in the vastness of the night. I drove back to my hotel in a daze. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in my room, replaying those 3 seconds over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself that I'd misidentified something. A large bear standing upright, a person in a costume, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But I knew what I'd seen. The next morning I did something that I'd never done before in my career. I lied in my field notes. I described the location inaccurately. I omitted the encounter from my preliminary report. When asked about unusual activity, I said I'd heard some vocalizations that I couldn't identify, but assumed were elk or possibly a large predator. I erased the encounter from the official record, but I couldn't erase it from my mind. For the next month, I was obsessed. I returned to the location repeatedly, bringing better cameras, recording equipment, thermal imaging devices. I spent thousands of dollars trying to capture what I'd seen. I told my wife I was extending the documentary work. I told my colleagues I'd identified an interesting wildlife corridor that deserved more investigation. None of it was true. I was hunting. My wife, Rachel, noticed the change. She noticed I was gone more frequently. She noticed I was distracted during dinner. She noticed that the man who came home was increasingly not the man she'd married. "What's going on?" she asked me one night, and I almost told her. I almost said, "I saw something impossible and I need to prove it's real, because if I don't, then I'm losing my mind and I can't lose my mind." Instead, I said, "Just working on something. You'll understand when I'm ready to talk about it." 3 months later, I found nothing. No additional sightings, no clear footage, no proof, just thousands of dollars spent and a growing sense of desperation that I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding delusional. I did something then that I'd never done before. I reached out to the fringe community, the Bigfoot researchers, the cryptozoologists, the people I'd previously dismissed as pseudoscientists and conspiracy theorists. I found online forums and Facebook groups and subreddits dedicated to Bigfoot sightings and research methodologies. And I discovered that I wasn't alone in my obsession. There were thousands of us. People who'd seen something impossible and couldn't move forward with their lives until they'd proven it was real. Within weeks, I was deep in this world, spending hours reading encounter reports, studying footage, analyzing footprint casts, constructing theories about breeding populations and migration patterns. I was approaching it the way a scientist should, with rigor and skepticism, but I was also approaching it the way an obsessed person does, with an intensity that was consuming my entire life. Rachel gave me an ultimatum in March of 2016. Either you talk to someone, a therapist, a doctor, I don't care, or you move out, she said. We were in our kitchen. She was standing by the window, backlit by Portland's gray afternoon light. I don't know what happened out there in the forest, but whatever it was, it's destroying you. And it's destroying us. I remember feeling defensive. I remember trying to explain that I wasn't crazy, that I'd seen something real, that I just needed time to figure out what it meant. She listened to me, and when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. I love you, but I can't watch you destroy yourself over something that doesn't exist. And I can't be the person you destroy along the way. 2 weeks later, I moved into an apartment. 2 months later, we started divorce proceedings. By the end of that year, the marriage was dissolved. My colleagues at the production company were sympathetic, but they were also concerned. I'd missed deadlines, I'd delivered subpar work, I was increasingly unreliable. They offered me a leave of absence, which I took, and eventually I simply didn't go back. My career in documentary filmmaking was over. The reputation I'd spent 15 years building was destroyed, not through scandal or failure at my craft, but through obsession with something I couldn't prove. My therapist, the one Rachel had insisted I see, suggested that the sighting might have been a stress-induced hallucination, a vivid waking dream brought on by isolation and exhaustion. It was possible, she said. The mind was capable of extraordinary things. When a person was under stress, sometimes it created experiences that felt utterly real, but were, in fact, manifestations of internal conflict. I listened to her. I took the medication she prescribed. I went through the motions of accepting that I'd been mistaken, that I'd imagined the creature, that the obsession was a symptom of psychological distress, not a pursuit of truth. But I didn't believe her, and deep down, I think she knew I didn't. By 2017, I was alone. I had savings, enough to live modestly for a while, and I had lost everything that had previously defined me. My marriage, my career, my social circle, my reputation. So I did the only thing that made sense. I disappeared. I found the cabin on Craigslist. It was 30 miles from the closest town, in a valley that received minimal internet and no cell service. The property was overgrown and had been empty for 2 years. The owner, an elderly man named Frank, was just happy to have someone maintain it. I signed a 5-year lease with an option to buy. I moved in with a truck full of equipment, cameras, recording devices, thermal imaging technology, all the tools I'd accumulated in my obsession. And I made a decision that I told myself was scientific, but was actually fundamentally a desperate attempt to prove that I wasn't insane. I was going to prove the creature was real, and I was going to do it alone. The first year in the cabin was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, obsessive quiet. I spent my days hiking the surrounding forest looking for signs, scat, hair samples, footprints, anything that might indicate the presence of a large primate. I found nothing that was conclusively not explainable by conventional wildlife. The second year, I expanded my search area. I followed reports from other researchers in Oregon and Washington. I drove to remote locations and hiked in with my camera gear. I spent thousands more on equipment. I was living on savings that were steadily depleting, and I didn't care. The external world had become irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was solving the question that had consumed me for 3 years. Is Bigfoot real? By the time I reached the third year in 2020, I was approaching genuine financial crisis. My savings were nearly depleted. I was 46 years old with no career, no marriage, no social connections, no prospects. If someone had looked at my life from the outside, they would have seen a cautionary tale. A man who'd thrown everything away to chase a delusion. That's when I made the decision about the cameras. I had access to 12 professional-grade wildlife cameras. They were a mixture of cameras I'd purchased and some older ones I'd kept from my documentary days. The quality varied. but each one was capable of producing clear, time-stamped footage. The idea was elegant in its desperation. I would create a network of cameras positioned around my cabin and the surrounding territory. I would leave them in place for an extended period, months if necessary, and simply let them do the work. I couldn't miss a sighting if it was all being recorded continuously. In theory, this made sense. In practice, what I was doing was committing to a level of obsession that would have terrified most people. I spent 3 weeks in early 2020 identifying camera placement locations. I wanted a perimeter that covered roughly 8 square miles of forest around my cabin. The cameras needed to be positioned at what I calculated were likely travel corridors, areas where large animals would naturally move through the forest. I hiked over 50 miles, carrying heavy equipment through snow and rain and mud, marking locations and testing sightlines. I was in peak physical condition by that point. The obsession had given me a kind of manic energy that manifested as relentless activity. By late February, I had all 12 cameras in place and synchronized. They were set to record continuously during the hours of darkness, when large primates were most likely to be active, and to take time-lapse photos during daylight hours. Each camera had a backup power system. Each one was positioned to send data to a secure cloud storage account when it connected to the satellite internet terminal I'd set up in the cabin. The system was, by any objective measure, professionally rigorous. If a large animal passed within range of any of the cameras, the footage would be recorded. I sat in my cabin the night I activated the system, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. This was it. This was going to be the moment when everything made sense. When I could finally prove to myself, and maybe eventually to the world, that I wasn't crazy. The first week of footage was unremarkable. Deer, a few raccoons, owl activity in the nighttime footage. Exactly what you'd expect from any wildlife monitoring system in a remote forest. I watched it obsessively anyway. 8 to 10 hours a day, sitting in front of my laptop, reviewing footage, analyzing movement patterns, looking for anomalies. Week 2 brought a few more interesting sightings. A cougar passing through one of the camera ranges, a black bear in the early dawn hours. Good footage that, in my previous career, I would have considered valuable. Now it felt like noise. It wasn't what I was looking for. By week 3, I was already experiencing what I can only describe as withdrawal. The hope I'd felt was morphing into anxiety. What if the cameras didn't catch anything? What if the creature, if it existed at all, had moved to a different territory? What if I'd built an entire system designed to prove something that, in fact, wasn't there? It was during week 3 that I heard my ex-wife's voice in my head saying, "I can't watch you destroy yourself over something that doesn't exist." And I realized she might be right. Week 5 is when everything changed. I was reviewing night footage from camera 7, which I'd positioned near a small creek that ran through my property. The footage was time-stamped 2:47 a.m. on March 18, 2020. A figure passed through the camera's range, a large dark shape moving with a distinctive gait. My hands started shaking. I rewound the footage and watched it again and again and again. It was tall. It was massive. It moved like no bear or cougar would move. The body mechanics were wrong for any known animal. The shoulders were too broad, the arms were too long. The way it moved suggested bipedal locomotion, walking on 2 legs, not 4. For the first time in 3 years, I had clear, unambiguous footage of something that shouldn't exist. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt something more complex, relief mixed with a strange kind of sadness that I couldn't fully articulate. Over the next 2 weeks, cameras 1, 3, and 7 all captured footage of the creature. It was moving through the forest with what seemed like purpose. It was following a specific route. It was visiting certain locations repeatedly. I began to catalog the footage, to analyze the creature's movements, to build a map of its territory. What I discovered was unexpected. The creature was moving slowly. Its gait was uneven. In some of the footage, it stopped and remained stationary for long periods. In other footage, it would move a short distance, rest, then move again. This wasn't the behavior of a creature in its prime. This was the behavior of something that was struggling. I didn't want to acknowledge what I was seeing. I told myself I was reading too much into the footage, that I was projecting human interpretations onto animal behavior, that the limp could be a normal variation in gait, that the rest periods could mean anything. But in my heart I knew. The creature was sick, or injured, or old. The creature was dying. Over the following weeks, as April turned into May, the footage became increasingly disturbing. The creature's visits became less frequent. When it did appear on camera, It moved even more slowly. The distances between locations decreased. It seemed to be confining itself to a smaller and smaller territory. I began to recognize it as an individual, the way it moved, the specific pattern of its fur, the distinctive way it positioned its body. I started thinking of it as him. Though I had no way of confirming sex, the size and build suggested male to me. I found myself checking the cameras obsessively, not with the frantic energy of someone seeking proof, but with something closer to dread. I was afraid of what I would find, or more accurately, I was afraid of what I wouldn't find. By mid-May, I'd noticed something else in the footage that I hadn't anticipated. He was visiting my cabin, not approaching it aggressively, not trying to get inside or raid supplies. He was simply standing at the edge of my clearing, watching the cabin. The footage showed him doing this at night when he thought he was unobserved. He would stand motionless for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes, just watching. I realized in that moment that he knew the cameras were there. Or at least he knew something had changed in his environment, and instead of avoiding the cameras, instead of moving away from my cabin and the technology I'd installed, he was moving toward them. He was allowing himself to be recorded. This understanding hit me with an intensity that was almost physical. He wasn't just an animal, he was a conscious being. He was aware of my presence, and on some level I couldn't fully comprehend. He was choosing to be seen. I thought about my therapist's suggestion that my original sighting had been a hallucination, a stress-induced manifestation. I thought about how much easier my life would have been if that were true, if I could have accepted that interpretation and simply moved on. But this creature, this real, dying, conscious being, he had forced me to accept a different reality, a reality in which something impossible was real, a reality in which the obsession that had destroyed my life was justified. Except now, having finally proven myself right, I discovered that being right didn't feel the way I'd imagined it would. June brought rain and cooler temperatures. The creature's visits to my cabin became more frequent. He was coming almost every night now, standing in the clearing, watching. The camera footage showed him with increasing clarity as he spent longer periods in the same locations. And the footage showed his deterioration with heartbreaking clarity. His movements became shuffling. His breathing, visible in the thermal imaging footage, became labored. He was moving like something was causing him deep pain. The vitality that had characterized his earlier movements was gone. I was watching him die in real time, and I was documenting it with 12 cameras. One night in mid-June, I made a decision that surprised me. I left the cabin door unlocked. I left out a pile of fresh vegetables, carrots, apples, some dried fish I'd purchased. I left them in the clearing where the cameras could see them. A deliberate offering. I wasn't sure why I did it. Some part of me wanted to help. Another part wanted to see if he would accept something from me. Another part wanted to make some kind of peace with the obsession that had consumed me. The footage the next morning showed he had visited. He hadn't eaten the offerings. His stomach issues, I would later understand, probably made food intake difficult. But he had examined them carefully. He had spent time near them, seeming to understand what they meant. Someone was offering care. That week I made a decision that felt like a turning point. I stopped researching. I stopped trying to document data. I stopped trying to build a scientific framework around what I was seeing. Instead, I just watched. I reviewed the footage every day, but not as a scientist gathering data, as a person bearing witness to something profound, to something that mattered in a way that had nothing to do with proof or vindication. I began to understand something about the creature that had evaded me through all the years of obsession. He had been alone, not in the sense of being solitary. Wildlife documentaries had taught me that many species are solitary hunters or travelers, but in a deeper sense, in the sense of being watched by humans who wanted to exploit him, or kill him, or study him. For a creature that intelligent, solitude wasn't just a way of living. It was survival strategy. And now at the end of his life, he had chosen to watch me watching him. He had chosen to trust that at least one human was different, at least one human wasn't a threat. I felt a profound shift in my understanding of why I'd been obsessed with this creature in the first place. It wasn't about proving myself right. Not really. Somewhere deep in my subconscious, I think I was looking for something that was real, something authentic in a life that had become increasingly hollow. The obsession was looking for connection, even if it was connection to something impossible. And now, with the creature dying slowly in the forest outside my cabin, I had that connection. This is the moment where the story shifts from mystery to something more intimate. If you want to know what happened next, what the creature revealed through those final weeks of footage, please hit subscribe. This channel explores the deep psychological stories behind cryptid encounters. New videos every week. And please comment below. What would you do if you had proof of something impossible? By early July, I had revised my understanding of what the footage was showing me. He wasn't alone. One evening, I was reviewing night footage from camera 4, positioned near what I'd started thinking of as his resting place, a rocky outcrop sheltered by overhanging trees. In the footage, 2 figures appeared. The large one I'd been tracking, and a smaller one, younger by the look of it, less bulky, different gait. At first I assumed it was a female, perhaps a mate, but as the weeks of footage accumulated, I began to understand the relationship differently. The young one was following the old one, learning. The old one would move to a location and the young one would follow. The old one would demonstrate something, how to access water perhaps, or how to find shelter from the rain, and the young one would observe and learn. It was teaching. The creature that was dying was spending its final weeks passing knowledge to a younger member of the species. My cameras weren't just documenting the last chapter of one life. They were documenting the beginning of legacy, the continuation of the species through the transmission of survival knowledge. I began to understand the footprints I'd been analyzing for 3 years in a different light, not as evidence of unknown biology, but as evidence of culture. These creatures had knowledge that had been passed down. They had methods of survival that had been taught. They had a way of being in the world that depended on learning and transmission across generations. By the end of July, the old creature, I had started to think of him as elder, though I kept this to myself, was moving very slowly. The footage showed him struggling to cover distances that he'd previously traversed easily. His breathing in the thermal footage was increasingly labored, but the young one was always near him, following, watching, learning. One night, I made another offering. This time it was meat, venison from a deer I'd processed the previous fall. I left it near one of the camera locations where Elder had been spending time. The next morning's footage showed Elder unable to eat. His body simply wasn't capable of processing the food, but the young one had eaten. Elder had provided the location, and the young one had benefited from the resource. Even in dying, he was providing. I found myself watching the footage with tears running down my face. Not the tears of vindication that I'd expected to shed when I finally had proof, but tears of witness, of bearing testimony to something profound and beautiful and utterly heartbreaking. The obsession that had cost me my marriage, my career, my social connections, it had been leading me to this, to the realization that the most important discoveries aren't about proving something exists. They're about understanding what that existence means, what it costs, what it offers. By the end of August, I had months of clear, unambiguous footage of a Bigfoot family. I had documented the creature's health decline. I had documented the teaching behavior. I had documented something that, if shared with the scientific community, would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and behavior. I had proof, real, undeniable, publishable proof, and I had to make a choice about what to do with it. The rational part of my brain, the part that had been a documentary filmmaker, the part that still believed in science and the advancement of human knowledge, wanted to catalog the footage, to present it to researchers, to become the person who finally, definitively proved that Bigfoot was real. I imagined the vindication, the press conferences, the interviews, the way my career would be resurrected, the way Rachel might see me differently, might understand that I wasn't delusional, but prescient, that I'd been right all along. I imagined redemption, but I also imagined what would happen next. The location would be compromised. Other researchers would converge on the area. Hunters would come, claiming they wanted to study or protect the species. Governments would get involved. There would be capture attempts, there would be conflict. There would be all the chaos that follows the exposure of something precious. Elder and the young one would lose their sanctuary. And on a deeper level, I understood something that I'd been avoiding for 3 years. My obsession with proving the creature's existence hadn't been about advancing science. It had been about proving myself, about proving that I wasn't crazy, about rebuilding an identity that had been shattered. But the creature didn't exist for my redemption. The creature existed for itself, for its own life, its own family, its own way of being in the world. And if I truly cared about it, if the connection I felt was genuine, then I had to prioritize its existence over my vindication. I spent a week wrestling with the decision. I made backup copies of the footage. I encrypted everything. I created detailed catalogs and analysis documents. I prepared it all for potential publication. And then in early September, I deleted it. Not all of it. I kept a small archive of the most significant clips stored on encrypted drives in a waterproof container buried in my cabin's foundation. Evidence that the encounter had happened. Proof, if I ever needed it, that I hadn't been delusional, that the obsession had been rooted in something real. But the detailed analysis, the location data, the behavioral notes, the footage that could be used to locate and study or capture the creatures, all of that I deleted from my cloud storage. I deleted it from my laptop. I destroyed the external hard drives. I erased the evidence. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Because deleting the footage felt like deleting the reason I'd devoted 3 years of my life to obsession. It felt like admitting that the obsession had been pointless, that the sacrifice had been wasted. But as I pressed delete for the final time, I felt something shift in my chest. A lightening, a release of pressure that I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. I wasn't trying to prove myself anymore. I was finally just bearing witness. September arrived with the start of autumn. The forest began its transition toward winter. The footage showed Elder moving slower than ever. His visits to my cabin became less frequent. Some nights there was no sign of him at all. I began to prepare myself for the inevitable. On September 18th, 2020, I have the timestamp saved. The footage from camera 3 showed something I'd been dreading. Elder, moving very slowly, to a sheltered location near a grove of old-growth cedar trees. He settled into a position that looked almost like rest, though something in his posture suggested finality. The young one appeared in the footage a few minutes later. He approached Elder carefully, watching intently. They remained together in that location throughout the night. The next morning, camera 3 showed only the young one, waiting, watching, checking back on the spot where Elder had rested. The oldest member of their species, at least in my documentation, was gone. I stood in my cabin that morning, watching the footage on my laptop, and I cried. Not from triumph, not from vindication, from loss, from the profound sadness of witnessing the end of something precious. But here's what the footage showed in the days that followed. The young one didn't leave the territory. Instead, he began to move through the locations that Elder had visited. He traveled to the water source. He visited the rest areas. He went to the feeding locations. He was mapping out the knowledge Elder had transmitted. The species would continue. The knowledge would be passed on. The culture would persist, even if one individual was gone. I watched that footage, and I finally understood what Elder had been doing those final weeks. He hadn't been dying in despair. He had been teaching with purpose. He had been ensuring that his knowledge, his survival strategies, his way of being in the world, would continue through the young one. It was the most elegant expression of legacy I'd ever witnessed. It's now 2025. 5 years have passed since Elder died. 5 years since I made the choice to delete the footage and protect the secret. I'm still in the cabin. I've maintained the camera system, though I keep it far less obsessively now. The young one, I think of him as Air, though that's probably an anthropomorphic reading of a creature I can never fully understand, still moves through this territory. I catch glimpses of him occasionally. He's grown larger, stronger, he's becoming an elder himself, or at least heading in that direction. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers my offerings, if he understands that the human in the cabin was different from other humans, if he carries some memory of a time when another being bore witness to his struggle and chose compassion over exploitation. I'll never know. What I do know is that my life has changed fundamentally. The obsession that consumed me for 3 years didn't disappear. It transformed. Now, instead of trying to prove something, I'm simply observing. I'm maintaining this cabin, protecting this territory, and bearing witness to something magnificent. My therapist would probably say I've found a healthier expression of the same underlying patterns. And maybe she'd be right. But I don't think so. I think I've simply found purpose in a different place than I'd been looking. The vindication I thought I needed, proving myself right, proving my sanity, rebuilding my reputation. None of that matters anymore. What matters is that 2 creatures, separated from me by species and understanding and millions of years of evolution, came to trust that at least one human was different. At least one human saw them and chose to protect them rather than expose them. I never went back to filmmaking. I never tried to rebuild my career. My marriage never reformed. The relationships I'd damaged were never repaired. But I found something in that loss, a purpose that wasn't about external validation, a meaning that existed independent of proof. Occasionally I think about the footage I deleted. I think about the scientific revolution I could have sparked. I think about how differently my life would have played out if I'd shared it. And I'm grateful I didn't. Because the greatest discovery I've made isn't about what Bigfoot is. It's about what bearing witness to another being's struggle teaches you about yourself. It's about learning that some things are more important than vindication. That protection can matter more than proof. That sometimes, the most scientific thing you can do is observe something without trying to exploit it. I want to end with something I've learned through 5 years of living in this cabin, maintaining these cameras, and bearing witness to a species that the world doesn't believe exists. The greatest discoveries aren't always the ones that change everything. Sometimes they're the ones that change you. Sometimes they're the quiet realizations that arrive in the footage of a dying creature teaching a young one how to survive. Sometimes they're the understanding that comes from choosing to protect something rather than expose it. Elder taught me something in those final weeks that all my years of obsession never could have taught me. He taught me that consciousness isn't measured by whether the world believes you exist. It's measured by the relationships you form, the knowledge you transmit, the way you face your own mortality with grace and purpose. When I see air moving through the forest now, strong and capable and alive, I know that Elder succeeded. His life meant something. His death meant something. And the knowledge he carried forward continues. That's immortality, that's legacy. And that's worth more than proof.